Broadcasting under the night sky from the edge of an undisclosed jungle on the Gulf of Mexico, I'm Christopher Garitano, your voice in the night. For the next hour, allow me to be your guide into the bizarre unknown, the fantastic macabre, and together we'll journey to that borderland between fiction and reality, a place beyond all rational explanation. We are now off to the witch.
And he went up there inside the radar tower. It was back in the late 80s, before they started cleaning the place up. And they were on the second or third floor, and there was this machine, and it had this big glass dome on it, and this thing coming in the center, and they're just messing around trying to break stuff, trying to break the glass, and one after the other, there's bouncing off the glass. So they turn around to leave, and all of a sudden the dome shatters and makes this hissing sound come out of it, because I guess it had some sort of compressed gas inside of it. And they run downstairs, they run out of the building. They go there the next day, and the whole machine itself just disappeared from the building, and it was like a 1 or 2 ton device.
That was an interview with the mighty Paul Nathan Fagan, who spent his entire life exploring the mystery of the Camp Hero Air Force Station. The long-abandoned military base is located in the remote fishing and vacation town of Montauk, New York, where Paul grew up, and the stories within the 415 acres range from twilight hour UFOs emerging from the ocean, time travel experiments in a secret facility deep beneath the ground, bizarre monsters unleashed from unknown dimensions, to the more horrific tales of runaway children kidnapped and brought to the base for brutal mind control experiments. What is it that draws a soul to spend their life seeking a particular mystery or adventure? It's one of the questions in my own heart and mind every time I either talk to a bold explorer of undiscovered subjects or when I choose to dive into the unknown myself. In Paul Fagan's case, it was a motion picture that first inspired him. When Paul was a child, he saw the 1985 Richard Donner Steven Spielberg film, The Goonies, a story about a gang of kid adventurers in a seaside town who embark on a local expedition to search for the buried treasure of a legendary pirate. Paul could relate to many elements in the film, including the U.S. Pacific Coast location of tall cliffs overlooking ocean beaches, as the far east coast Montauk Point is geographically similar. But his hometown also held its own real mystery, and a greater one than fiction could serve. From the enormous dark tower in the form of a sage radar station looming over the small town to an adjacent haunted lighthouse, Paul knew then that Camp Hero was his very own mystery to solve. He felt it belonged to him in many ways. It was tangible, and he could explore only miles from his backyard. Paul tragically left our world only 1 week ago, but he left behind his own legend that's directly intertwined with one of the world's greatest unsolved conspiracies. Join me for tonight's adventure as we go deep into Camp Hero and experience what it's like to explore the base and its mystery firsthand. Stay tuned and I'll return after this commercial break.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Steven Spielberg presents The Goonies, a Richard Donner film.
Time, chump.
Hey, Mike found the map! Whoa, do you guys realize what we could do? I don't want to go on any more of your crazy Goonie adventures.
Meet Mikey,
I gotta go fast.
Brand, Andy,
Shame. Come on, Brand. Slip her the tongue.
That's disgusting. No, I can't even look.
Mouth,
I gotcha. Now get out from behind there. You're ruining the painting. You're ruining my joke.
Stephanie, Data,
Booty bangers. Ow. Guys, isn't that neat?
and Chunk.
It's locked. Thanks, Chunk.
They call themselves the Goonies. They've stumbled onto a legend, but they're not alone.
Chunk, I hope that was your stomach.
No. That's the it. Sounds like calm.
Discover what they uncover.
It was full of rubies and emeralds and diamonds.
The lost map.
Whoa! There's the start of the tunnel.
The secret caves.
Hey, Mikey! You can hear me! Run! Run! They're coming after you!
The hidden clues.
Mikey!
The treacherous traps.
Oh, Sheriff! I'm at the Lighthouse Lounge, and I want to report a murder.
Just like that last prank about all those little creatures that multiply when you throw water on them.
Take the oath.
They're here! Somebody's coming!
Join the adventure. As Steven Spielberg presents The Goonies, a Richard Donner film.
Welcome back to Off to the Witch. I'm your host, Christopher Garitano, and tonight's guest not only knew Paul Fagan and worked with him, but also shares his magnificent obsession. Brian Minnick is one of the original Camp Hero explorers, and he's compiled some of the most compelling evidence that I've witnessed in my nearly 2 decades of researching and adapting the Montauk Enigma. So here's my interview with Brian Minnick.
Yeah, I was born in Southampton, actually, Southampton Hospital. And I've always lived on the outskirts, in the outskirts of the Hamptons. So it's more, we were actually sent to a district over into Riverhead, which was like the county seat where the two forks come together. So it was quite the stretch to go to Montauk. But as a kid, my family would always go out there to Montauk Point and tailgate in the parking, hang out in the parking lot, barbecue. And there was other families with other kids that were a friend of mine, the same age. And, we got to exploring at some point. We had been there a bunch of times before we even found Camp Hero. But, my family would go out there to the Montauk Parade. That was another thing. And I started seeing, that area as a kid. So I must have been like 7 or 8 years old. But I didn't go into climbing into a bunker until I was about 12.
So let's rewind to the point where you discovered, because Montauk, I spent time there when I was a kid too, and it's far from New York City. It's all the way on the furthest eastern tip of Long Island. You get there and it's summertime or the fall time, and it's supposed to be a family getaway, essentially. When was it that and you grew up in Southampton, which is not that far from Montauk anyway, so you're literally driving around the corner, correct?
Not really, because I'm in Riverhead, basically. Southampton doesn't want the part of town that I'm from, so they gave us, forced us into Riverhead, basically. They totally don't acknowledge the area I'm from. It's actually it was the poorest county in the Suffolk County for many years. I think it still is. Riverside and Flanders basically is where I grew up. And, don't get me wrong. Now there's $1 million houses here. It's on the water and it's a really nice area. It's on the bay, but people gave it a bad rap for many years and it used to have a lot of crime. So it's not like I was in the Hamptons, but technically I am in the Hamptons, where I grew up. So from that point onward, going to Montauk is probably about 45 miles from me. So and the traffic on the way back is always a 3-hour trip, as you know.
As a kid, when did you discover that there was that giant radar tower and a defunct base, military base?
Yeah, that wasn't like a turning point in my life. One day we just got on bikes because they had like mags, not mags out, pegs on their back. They had a lot of bikes, my friends, but I wasn't as into it as they were. So I think I was riding on somebody's pegs, and there was three others, friends of mine with bikes. Two brothers. One was a younger brother that was younger than all of us, and then two best friends, and then me, a family friend. So we went off and we took the shortcut. There's like a little path that you can go if the far side of the lighthouse parking lot. There's a little cut that goes onto the road that loops around. And from there, the entryway to Camp Hero, the modern, the park entry now, it's actually right there as well. So we just went in a straight line down that road and we found Battery 216 because it's right off on the left there. And it was open. There was a brick missing, one brick. So, and there was a really strong gust of wind blowing out of the tunnel. It was pretty amazing. It was like hurricane force winds shooting out of this little
And
hole.
can you describe Battery 216? Because it's enormous, right?
It is. It's much bigger than people miss it all the time. I pointed out sometimes because I told my friends when we first went there that it was right in that area, but people just were beelining for the radar back then, which I don't blame them. I was too. But Battery 216 is a twin 6-inch gun bunker, basically. With they shoot really huge projectiles they were anti-aircraft guns and also anti-submarine guns. So they had a whole bunch of bunkers around Montauk just to do trigonometry and triangulate the shots. And then these two 6-inch guns were in support of the two massive pairs of guns at Camp Hero, the 12-inch guns, the 16-inch guns. I mean, those are the bunkers that we know, and see the most. But Battery 216 is this other bunker. And the weird thing about it is there's a massive underground in that bunker. And now, after all these years, I've been looking for details on it my whole life because of what happened on that day. And I'm finally starting to find other people who went in and saw the big hole in the floor, which I'm sure we'll get to in a minute, or at some point. But there's also another friend of mine who went down, and he's actually a business owner in Montauk, and he went down a few levels in that bunker to confirm that there is something about 4 stories deep below there. It's not on any blueprints, and I've seen it. That's one thing I've seen with my own eyes.
So, and what year was this?
This was in 1987 or in 1988, and that's where I'm trying to always pinpoint the date. I go back looking for the St. Patrick's Day parade of that year because I remember we skateboarded in the parade for a moment, and people thought we were supposed to be in the parade. So I was trying to identify the year by looking at pictures of that parade. That's how far I've been trying to figure out the date.
So in 87 or 88, and that predates the book that was released by Preston Nichols.
Yes.
At that time, when you were exploring the base, were there any rumors of anything other than it being a nearly defunct or fully defunct base at that time?
The base itself was abandoned. I mean, it was in disrepair already. I didn't see any signs or entries, to the base. We didn't see any activity. But I did read a strange story by Michelle Gearin, who was a writer back in the early internet, basically, when I first started researching heavily, around 2001, 2000. And she actually has a story about that bunker. And then going back to Montauk many years later and finally identified that it was indeed Battery 216. And that's still out there on the internet. It's definitely worth reading because I had something very similar happen to me inside that bunker as well. So that's why I always believed her story on that.
So I'm definitely going to want to hear the details of that. But once again, at that time, did you suspect there was anything strange going on at that base, or did you feel like you were just exploring a military relic?
Oh, I felt like it was a military relic until we got in, and it was black and we had no flashlights. So we're just feeling the walls. And then there was a hallway off to the right. And I said to my friend, "What's in there?" And he said, "It's just a plant on a table," and I thought that's weird as a plant. But at that very moment, as we were walking past that hallway, I got the weirdest imagination in my mind that I was looking through something's eyes at myself and my friends passing by the end of the hallway in very dark light. And then at the same time, I saw this weird reptilian creature. It was like something I saw in a Marvel comic later, and I was like, look, that's like the same exact kind of creature. It had a tail, like it was just like something in my imagination. So at that moment, I thought that was really weird. I saw like this dual view, in two directions, and I just thought it was strange. So that's what freaked me out later when I did read Michelle Guerin's. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Michelle Guerin. When I read her, blog, I guess it was, or write up on this, she described that thing, that exact, being to the T. And when I read that, I thought that's so strange because this happened to me like 12 years ago, and I just read her thing in 2001.
So you were there and you had a vision of one of these things.
Yeah, I thought it was just, my crazy imagination. It freaked me out though. So from that moment on, I thought this place is weird and creepy. And then when I got to the other end of that bunker, I thought it was even more dangerous and scary. That's because of the hole in the floor, which I'll get to, after I don't want to go past the vision that I had.
No, for sure. And just as a reference, okay. And how did you feel some years later when you may have, of course, picked up Preston Nichols' book and read that he was talking about a similar creature?
Oh yeah, it all. I mean, the more I saw references to anything like that, I started thinking, that's really, how strange could that? So strange that, I know I have a crazy imagination, and it's also something I don't talk about often because, I take my research seriously. And for other people, when you're trying to make a case built with like real facts, you don't want to mix in some of those things all the time because you know how people can lump you into a certain camp. But that is a legit, and I don't really know what I saw, but that's, I'm telling you like exactly what I saw. And I always thought of the possibility that yes, that could have been something there, but like not really there, but maybe trapped somehow in like a sliver of time or something. Or I felt like also I had an empathic feeling from it that it wanted our like to drain our energy, but it couldn't even lift a finger to get us. That's like what I thought. So I thought, this is creepy. Why would I think something so weird as I'm walking through this tunnel?
So okay. And how old were you in 88?
Yeah, I was about 11 or 12 years old.
Okay. And that's perfect because I just want to first, because we're going to go through the whole gamut, but I want to first remind the audience, because many of the audience members are probably explorers themselves, but some of them have never done anything like this before. So if you could take us back to that moment, because it must have been quite exciting to enter a base and you're filled with wonder and it's an adventure. Can you take us to the point where a 12-year-old is about to go on an adventure? Because a lot of it, we grow up and we see these things in movies, but now you're finally at a place where you can apply this yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So take us back there a little bit.
Yeah, I really did. It felt like a Goonies adventure at the very moment we were climbing through the brick because, you get in, there's still some daylight, but you round the first corner and you're like feeling the walls, for your way through. And it was totally exciting and exhilarating, but we really didn't know what we were getting into. And, we did almost die in that bunker that day.
How so? What happened?
Because we got to the other side of the hallway, the other end of the bunker, and then there was this mass of air coming up. We felt it, and as our eyes adjust, we start seeing like darker black spots, which, obviously we could kind of make out certain things. Plus, there was a little light start to appear ahead, just a very little bit, somewhere up ahead. So we realized there's this massive hole in the floorway, the whole hallway. The floor caved in from wall to wall, and it was just like a big circle. And the only thing left to step on to cross was a piece of rusted rebar, and it was sandwiched between two layers of concrete. So there was like maybe 6 or 8 inches of rebar, and it was like bent downward at the ends, So you had to step on this thing, hugging the wall, and then kind of inch over, and then you have to kind of run across it or something, get some speed. You don't want to lean against the wall too hard because then you'll fall backwards. And we didn't know how deep it was yet until we got to the other side. So then, when it was the next guy's time to cross, he went over, and then the guy would reach out that was already across and grab his jacket, my other friend. And then I remember I went like third, and I made my way across. And it was, there was one point in the middle where I almost like lost my balance, but then I felt those hands reach out and grab my jacket, and I just kind of jumped the rest up, sideways jumped over. And then the little brother came last. We made sure we all got our hands on them and yanked them over. So then we're like, let's see how deep this is, because there's air blowing up out of it, really cold air. And we take a big piece of broken cement. It was probably from the floor, a big chunk of concrete, and we dropped it. And it was like 1, 2, 3 or 4 seconds before it splashed into water. And we were like, we just realized that if we fell in there, we'd be nobody could ever get us out. I mean, to get machinery into the bunker, they'd have to break the walls. And I mean, who knows what's down there how deep the water is. It did sound like probably pretty deep, and maybe something natural made that hole, but
kids were so fearless back then. We would do the same. We would crawl through storm drains all day and go on these little adventures. And you had Camp Hero as the same thing was what we were doing. We were just like looking for something exciting.
Haunted houses, making we used to make ramps, in the neighborhood. But
is that essentially the draw for urban exploration? What became urban exploration?
I think so. Yeah, it was the abandoned ghost town ambience of a certain place that you could just kind of explore, and something kind of magical about it. I mean, it's just at the time, doing that for the first time, it's just something you don't forget kind of each time. I mean, it's hard to go someplace really cool and then, forget it. Someplace like that I've been drawn to it for forever. And, I have been lucky enough to go inside different parts of the base that were pretty hairy. And just recently we went, and everything was open. So we went in and, we climbed through, one thing was an old fan, like a vent, and we climbed through that to get in. And it's really dangerous in there. It's toxic. There's mold and asbestos and just so many particles in the air. I kind of regret going into that one operations computer building, but I was looking for some history in there. There's supposed to be 4 levels below that too, and I found a lot of military history that's pretty much spells it out.
So you've been exploring Camp Hero since 1988.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, you could say that. I mean, there was gaps in between from the time I did explore other parts of Montauk, down on Turtle Cove and that little bunker that was in the water. We climbed into that thing that rolled down the cliff near the lighthouse. We explored some of those peripheral things too back then. But yeah, pretty much exploring the Camp Hero property when I was young, not knowing, I knew there was a base there, but I thought that was just one lone bunker, like sitting on the beach. I didn't know there was a radar anywhere nearby until I read the book. When people told me there's a giant radar, I was thinking, where? I've been out there a million times and I've never seen a radar.
Yeah, it's amazing how so many vacations out there, and I'd never even noticed it until I started preparing to shoot Montauk Chronicles. The first
It's
version.
amazing.
Yeah, and now over the years, learning about people like yourself and about Paul Fagan, I know that people were interested in this for a very long time, and all of you have different perspectives on it respectively. I think Paul was leaning more towards the history of the place, and perhaps there were things hidden that were making people sick. I personally feel that leaning more towards your perspective, that there was much more going on there for sure. And I'm not somebody who wants to believe this thing happened. So at what point, let's say, so you're in there in 1988. It's dangerous as it tends to be, for young kids to be exploring such a derelict structure that does have quite a few dangers in it. But then you start to catch on that there really is a mystery there. And tell me more about that and how that progressed for you.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because it never lets me down. Anytime I go, there's always something really weird that happens, or I'll catch on film, and it's without fail. So I don't even try to look for things there, because sometimes they just happen and you catch them. But it's so I started figuring out it was really strange back pretty much after that day. I mean, we didn't want to cross back over the hole, so we kept going, and we found a way up out through a small crack. We had to climb up out, up a pile of dirt and out onto the beach. We literally came up out of the sand, and I thought, wow, that was really fun. That was exciting. It was dangerous. It was cool. And what is this place, and why is it in this condition? Why don't they just pile it, seal it up? I've had a lot of thoughts. And I was really drawn in deeper, though, when the books came out. My friends were all talking about it. I actually borrowed a copy from uh, Judge Ketchum's grandson, and I never was able to give it back to him, but it's signed from Preston and Peter Moon and Preston Nichols signed to Judge Ketchum best wishes, best wishes, because he was presiding over the trial, which they wrote about in the book, of them getting arrested on the base, and they had to go to court to fight the trespassing ticket. And basically, he's the one that they signed it to him because he presided over the court case, basically. And so I have that book, which was interesting, and that maybe dive in right away. I started like dreaming of working at like radome building bases, because I was reading the story so much. I would just like see a different radar base that has a dome on top, the white bubble radars. It's they're called radomes, but I've just dreamed that I worked at different places for a while. It was like a recurring dream. Like one was in a cornfield, one was on the water on a metal dock, and that one freaked me out because just 2 years ago I saw something about this place called Dauphin Island in Louisiana, and they showed that exact radar on the water with a metal dock. And I looked from Google because I was looking from across the water, and there's actually another dock over there, just like in my dream. And it was weird because I almost like remote viewed this place, but I don't think I ever worked there or anything like that. But there's these weird things that happen to people with dreaming in like you have it living another life in another time kind of thing. I've noticed that happens to a lot of people, even myself. And
Sure, a lot of people I've spoken to over the years have said similar things. And so these things start hitting you because I wonder, you're so drawn to the place. You start reading more about it through the books written by Nichols. Did you talk to anyone at the time who may have worked at the base or any other perspectives at the time?
yeah, I mean, I'm surrounded by people, family, friends. My God, there's so many connections to the base when it was active. People that my father worked at Sperry. That's the company that built the radar. He worked there after the radar was built. He was younger. He was in Vietnam, and then they sent him to Germany to work on helicopter avionics, and then he worked at Sperry Gyroscope, and that's I have the old ad from Sperry that for the ANFPS 35, a Sage radar advertisement from Sperry. But every time I've asked him about it, he really didn't have much insight. However, we used to go to the campground with a really good family friend, Howard Gordon, he was the chief of the Atlas Smasher, the Atom Smasher at Brookhaven National Labs for like so many years. He works in CERN. He's won parts of Nobel Prizes with them, and he's on the cover of their magazine. Everybody knows him. And he was the chief. And I'm thinking, here's a guy, who was like the chief of the Atom Smasher in a certain year. And here's, my father who worked at the company that built the radar. And then my mom's best friend's husband was a soldier. He worked at camp. He was at Camp Hero, Montauk Air Force Station, I should say, in 1979 and 1980 until they probably closed. And near the time they closed, he got transferred to Japan. I'm friends with his two daughters. And they don't talk to him anymore. He's in Japan, and he's like a martial arts expert. And he does some kind of katana swords. In fact, there's this place in Montauk called, there's a festival called the Strawberry Festival. And when I was a kid, they took me to watch him like chop a watermelon in half on some guy's stomach with a samurai sword. And he stopped within like millimeters of he cut the melon. And then he came and talked to us after because we were with his wife, And yeah, he was on the base. And my mom's significant other was stationed at the Nike missile site for many years in Rocky Point. Montauk Air Force Station was the one who would tell them when to launch. They would also tell the nuclear missiles in West Hampton when to launch. They had 28 bomb arc missiles, the Air Force, and the Army had the Nike site. They had 4 Nike missiles over in Rocky Point. They also had one in Amityville, Lido Beach. And I think Montauk, I have the articles that they were going to be the 5th Nike base. And guess where they were going to use to build the command center? I have all the official declassified documents of the Nike base for Camp Hero.
So you have all this amazing information, and over the years,
I've been digging lately into like the exact military history. I found so much. I'm still going to do the book like we talked about years ago.
And I have so much to ask you in this, but I want to, okay, number one, before I go any further with what I was just about to ask you, I want the audience to know, because this is probably after a few times of you exploring, what is usually in your equipment bag for your type of urban exploration, and what did you consistently bring with you after, I would say, I'm sure a few times you guys just went in blind, but then you probably put some things together.
Yes. So
Okay, so
back
what do you
then,
usually take with you?
yeah, starting back then in the 90s, the flashlights were terrible, but we'd grab all the household flashlights we could find in batteries. So we'd have, big plasticky red old school flashlights that look really dim lighting, but that would be a mainstay in all of our backpacks. And then we'd have to borrow a video camera, usually from a friend or anybody. So each time we went with a different handheld camera, which was about the size of like a tissue box back then. They were huge. And so that was, something we'd protect and keep safe at all costs. Then I would always try to bring a point and shoot camera with me whenever I had extra film and stuff. And I didn't bring any voice recorders ever because, we had the audio from the video recordings, but that's about all we used to bring, actually. Just something to, I actually brought a paper and pen with me, and I would jot down notes. I've kept really detailed notes of every trip I've ever been to the base, including recently. Since back then, they started out sketchy, and I had to retranslate a few, but while they were fresh in mind. But I still have like the original papers that I wrote down back then. I actually photocopied at one point because I knew I'd be going back, so I started making field reports and just the basics. But now I'm typing them into full chapters, to add a little more descriptive, so people when they read them, I hope that to put that into everything. But I have kept track of most of the details.
Yeah, and eventually you plan to put this all in a book. It's going to be amazing,
Thank you. I know you kind of mentioned doing it a long time ago when we were filming the Dark Files.
Yeah,
And,
it has to be, man. And you're the one to do it. It has to happen.
Yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate that. And I've actually, in homage to Paul, I've followed some of the paths that we talked about extensively about the history and the placement of all the different, every single facility. And, I took that further and I was excited to show him one day. But I think that would be a good thing to mention. Some of the things that he had told me I followed and did find some interesting things.
For sure. I mean, you found a kindred spirit in Paul Fagan. Paul was kind of a loner in my experience with him. He would be roaming around the base a lot and just kind of meditating on the place. And he was the first one that showed me around and got me into the tower and all of that for Montauk Chronicles. And it was Eric Swanson and I, and Paul led us through the whole base, and he knew so much about it. And the thing is, when you're making a movie, you have to include everything you've collected, as I mean, like,
Yes.
I needed to hear the words of these men, whether you believe them or not. But just as interesting, and the reason, or one of the reasons for this episode, is that I think it's just as important to hear your experience, if not more so than hearing Preston Nichols tell the story again, because
Yeah,
you have, yeah, you're an unbiased witness, and you spent so many years collecting information that never made it to those books. Can you give me an overview of what it's like to go through that? And did you have skepticism the whole time, or were you convinced that there was much more to this base than what's in the history book or in the ledger?
That's a good question. Yes, I definitely wavered back and forth through believing, not believing, skeptic. I always like to think of the possibilities, and I always like to add extra possibilities. Like, oh, you think it could be this, this, or this? I said it could even be this and this and this. So I'm open to the ideas, and I did give a lot of things consideration and ran it through the gamut. Is it possible? Is it likely? Probably not, but that's why it's strange and weird. When it came to Preston, though, from the very first moment, and the whole crew, actually, I kept my distance. I went for a reason, I guess. I knew that there was people that were going to them for help, for deprogramming. I've heard a little bit about it because they were talking about it. They were very open about it, and I thought that could be a little bit of something closer. You have to be, they're in close with them. But at the time as a kid, I was still 16. I went with friends. We went to a public place, and I really wanted to talk to them and interview them and get to meet them even, if they were time traveling. I thought, hey, I'd like to meet these people, but also I thought the story was fascinating. The book was well written. I mean, it drew you in. It really did. And I talked to Peter Moon later once, and he was, he was really beyond the story now. I think he was just like he was not really doing much with it anymore. He's moved on to other things. And I never got to talk to Preston really again, but I did talk to him twice, at those two meetings. And it turns out my good friend of mine, his wife, and Danielle's friend, my wife's friend, at the same time, she's Preston's cousin. And so she gives me this book, and it's signed on the inside, Ginny Nichols, that's Preston's mother, because my friend didn't want it in the house because it has like really amazing art, but some of it's like a little dark, and he's really religious, so he just didn't want it in the house. And I said, I'll gladly take it. And then when I found out it had his mom's signature, I thought, oh, that's awfully, strange to come across this book. But I asked her, I said, did Preston ever really work anywhere that the family knows about? Like, did he really work at Montauk that you guys know about? Did he tell the family he worked there? And she said, yeah. She said he told us all that he worked there all those years ago. And I thought that was like, wow, that's really messed up, because maybe he did work. I mean, nobody else ever says they remember him, because I'm not friends, but I'm on the Facebook page with a lot of the veterans, and I post like old history stuff that they're looking for to help, try to help out, maybe share some of the old stuff with them. And they, they're they have a very specific view about what went on there. It's very, I don't think they even knew, they don't know a lot of what the Army did there because they were Air Force.
Right. And this is where it gets confusing, because I've spoken to people who worked at the base as well, and I've received a variety of responses from them. But if we really go back to what Nichols and Bielik said, is that they were traveling from Brookhaven Labs under the ground to Camp Hero, and unbeknownst to people who may have worked topside. So it was compartmentalized, and they didn't really know of each other.
You're right. And the amazing thing, when you try to look, is it possible? Because I've looked into this, and I said, when were maglev trains invented? Because it would have to be a bullet train, to make it efficient to go to work. And they were invented in 1968 in Brookhaven National Labs. I know the first one was built in Japan, but the base went through a very interesting cycle in the 70s. They shut down Suffolk County Air Force Base because Montauk used to send radar signals and dispatch the fighter jets. They had all of the other radars on the site, different buildings, to talk to jets, radio to jets in the air. And they would dispatch jets from the base in West Hampton, and that closed down. And the missile base closed down, and they took all these radars out of commission, and everything really shut down. And there was no reason to have the base anymore in 1969. But it stayed open under ADTAC from 1970 till its closing in 1981. And then the last people left the Gator building in 1984, they say. But so that's all in the history. But in that period, there was nothing to do there. It was a lax topside operation. Civilians were waltzing in and out of the base. Kids were playing. They were having bands on Friday night, and people were partying. They were exploring, and it was just like anything goes there at that time. And you have to wonder, why are they there when there's no real mission? And why are they all just allowed to do anything? Because a decade before that, it was like you set foot on the property and they have machine guns aimed at you. So you're entering like a top facility where they did test a lot of brand new technology since the 30s. Everything they did in Montauk was like first. And they had the pre-SAGE testing there, the ESS, experimental SAGE. They did so much. MIT had a radar lab there, basically part of the Cape Cod system. I found all this amazing stuff, and I traced back the different underground, when different parts of the underground were built, because they're not all connected in one big piece on the top. The top layer, there's some old World War II tunnels. There's a lot of, I had to learn all the infrastructure on the base too, to map the underground. So I had to learn the sewage lines. I had to learn the SAGE had a power plant, which had steam tunnels that connected buildings in a straight line, and so on and so forth. So I'm putting them in different layers at different depths. I'm still trying to map everything. But, it's amazing that they say there's nothing underground. And now I've literally found proof. I have Freedom of Information documents, everything that show exactly where there's a lot of stuff underground.
Right. That denial has been blatant for so many years, but you have documented proof now. And when we were making the Dark Files, and I wanted to ask you a question of what you thought about one thing, uh, but we did use the electric resistivity imagery, and the geophysicists did prove that there was something enormous, the same thing you were looking at in 1988. And also, what's your perspective on, because when we were shooting the Dark Files, it was just out of the blue that Army Corps of Engineers was there in abundance drilling. It looked like just to keep us out of there, to tell you the truth. It just looked like a big production.
That was very strange. It was amazing how they were drilling in that area, because that's an area that I never considered to have anything, and I still wonder if there's some kind of ventilation opening over there. I just thought of that recently. Like, why don't I go back there and just check it where they were drilling? Because I have all their maps from those tests they were doing, and they drilled a lot of places, but it's very odd that they were there on the exact date of the filming. And another thing happened when we were filming. I don't know if you remember, but it was like the first thing that I filmed with you guys, and we jumped out the truck to film near where there used to be a hatch and a ladder going down that I had on tape from a long time ago, and now it was just covered over with cement. And all of a sudden, all of these parks vehicles pull up to the maintenance garage, and there's like 12 cars, and they're all getting out, and they're just standing there kind of like mulling around. And it was so purposeful. We thought it was really awkward, so we got in and we left.
You have been exploring this space for so many years, and the mystery and the history of the entire thing. Now, throughout that time, can you tell me about any resistance you may have encountered along the way, starting with the early days and moving forward?
Sure. Definitely in the early days, we were, I found out now there was like, they were doing a toxic cleanup, because it's actually a Superfund site. So we were coming across so many people on the base in that, on days they were working. There were EPA trucks, there were cops, there were black SUVs with tinted windows, the kind you see at B&L too, like white or black SUVs, at menacing looking SUVs. And then there was a lot of helicopters flying around. In particular, I saw Huey a couple times. I even took a picture of it because it was kind of floating over us. And my friends were like, oh, you're just being paranoid. And I was like pretending to tie my shoe. I'm like, why am I doing this? So I just turned around and took a picture of it. And I zoomed in, and it's an old like Vietnam era helicopter. But I didn't think anything of it until one day we were walking. There used to be a pink radar tower there, and there's like that road that comes up next to it. We were basically coming up that road, and we heard the chopper, and I knew it was coming really low, like really fast. So we just said, let's just run. So we ran into the pink radar building. We had to go, on an acute angle road, and then back towards where we came from, up into the third floor. And just as we got to the third floor, there's a back door that's open. You could kind of see. And this thing was lower than us, the helicopter. We were higher up than it. It was just over the treetops going down the road that we just ran from. And that freaked us out because I know people fly there privately, and if they saw kids, maybe they said, let's chase these kids. But it was a Huey again, which was an old, Vietnam era helicopter. I think they still use some form of it. It's an Army helicopter. So that was one time I thought that they were actually chasing us with a helicopter. But another time that's helicopter related was in 1999, we went, and there was like 7 or 8 of us in 2 cars. And we saw a Black Hawk coming from like the ocean, and it came over us at Camp Hero. But then when we drove back to town in Montauk, it was still following us with the light on. And then we turned a right to go towards the Montauk Manor to get away from it, but it veered and kind of went over us really slow at the manor. So we took a picture of that too. And then I have a helicopter on video down on Montauk Point, like flying into boats pretty much. Like it was like landing on the deck of the boat, and 4 different boats. So each boat that would come along, this helicopter would like harass them basically. And that was a little mini Bell, like 2-seater. It's called a Bell. And that's also the companion of the Huey in Vietnam. So that was really strange to see all those old helicopters flying around there. The Black Hawks are new.
And what do you think, after all of your experience and collected knowledge, why do you think those helicopters were there?
I think they had, so the Army Corps of Engineers was doing the toxic cleanup. it's possible they were doing some kind of surveillance of the property itself, and we weren't supposed to be on it, so they probably figured, let's just, buzz them and make them run to get them off the property. But when the people would chase us in the Jeeps, now that's when the real fun happened, when the SUVs would give us chase, because we would lead them on such a wild goose chase through there, because there was some places you can't drive through the roads, like when you run up onto Radar Hill. There's these steps, that connect both roads, but they're hundreds of feet apart.
So you were on foot at the time, or bikes, right?
Yeah, we were on foot. The only time we ever had the bikes was the very first time we went, and in the bunker and stuff. But other time, I would love to ride a bike through there. That would be great, because it's a lot of walking. But nowadays you can park right by the radar, so it's not so bad. But back then it was like you park at the lighthouse parking lot and you walk.
Right. So I just want to establish right now that back then it is completely different than now. You weren't really allowed on those grounds, correct?
No, you had to sneak the entire way. Yeah, including when you cross the highway, the loop highway where the lighthouse is. When you cross over there and you start entering the road that goes into Camp Hero, you're technically at that point trespassing. So it was crazy, because it's a public park. It was the only public park that you're not allowed to go in. I mean, and the New York state law was, or the national law, I guess it was, I have to double check that, but 85% of the park is supposed to be accessible if it's a public park, which it wasn't for many, many decades.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
10 seconds. The pain begins. In your flesh, in your brain. 15 seconds. You can't breathe. It chokes you. It destroys you. 20 seconds. You explode. Experience the terrifying power of scanners. Their thoughts can kill. Rated R. Restricted. Under 17. Not admitted without parent.
What year did it change?
It became a park in 2001. They opened the park. Until then, it was being destroyed in the late 90s, like 98, 99. They were already knocking buildings over in mass. They were taking all the radar towers down, the metal round radar towers that used to have the radomes. There used to be a lot of radomes there. They had, on Radar Hill, there was like 6 radars total. So operating, all present at the same time. So they knocked all those down, and it was, what's there today, it was the only thing that was left after what they did. So when they did those, final removals in 2000, basically, that's what the park is today, whatever's left.
And why do you think they feel comfortable now with, all of the documentaries that have been made, including the shows and docs I've made, and then, of course, Stranger Things drawing so many people to that base? And I haven't been there in a while. Number one, is there a lot of people going down there?
It's out of control.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so many people. Stranger Things has brought in so many people that you can't even go there without seeing people everywhere almost. But
and I'm sure they come from all over the world to go to Montauk, correct?
They really do, yeah. I even have friends that want to come out from Hawaii and go there. They want us to show them around there.
That's such an important thing, and I think that's really the core of what I wanted to talk to you about today, is that sense of adventure also continues to pull you through this whole thing. It continues to, because you were exploring this well before Stranger Things inspired other people to explore. And I think it's cool that Stranger Things does that.
Me too.
Yeah.
It is cool. I mean, that final decade of what I was saying, in order, the 2010s to the 2020s are practically, Montauk has become a tourist attraction for, Camp Hero has, State Park, for, the Stranger Things has brought tourism almost, like fun adventure tourism.
Right, curious from my perspective because I haven't been to Montauk in a while. So I have a feeling that the town of Montauk in the summertime has kind of banked on that, right? T-shirts and all sorts of stuff.
And also other shows. They have so many shows they're filming out there, and it's become this very popular vacation spot. But
Right. But
people
has
that
Montauk capitalized on the mystery that's at the center of town at this point, or no?
no,
Oh,
no,
they
and
haven't. Okay.
I don't think they have in that sense because I think they, they're like, oh, they don't really. I don't know. There's certain people in town that are, all into it and think that they were a part of it too. And then there's other people who just say, nothing went on out there. And I've actually talked to like the park superintendent. I sat there for an hour with Tom Dess, who's hard to get along with. But we talked strictly military history, and he was loving it. He was showing me cannonballs and all kinds of cool things. But I kept it on that level, and he was happy to call the cops on kids that were there trespassing. So he still guns it for people. But
All right. So I wanted to ask you a question about him because he's kind of a mysterious character to me. I never really talked to him directly. I talked to Dick White, but I didn't speak to Tom Dess. Tom Dess was always in the background of what I was doing, when I was making Strange World, the first episode. He was there kind of shutting down the show. He always seemed to be the guy that was shutting everything down. Do you feel, or do you know, that he's taking orders from someone else to do that, or he just doesn't like any of this stuff?
that's a good question. He has to have a higher up. Joe Lofrino told me that there is no position called superintendent. That's just what he calls himself. So the actual thing is like, he's like a supervisor of sorts, but there's always somebody, above, and he's answering to the state. And he talks to the Army Corps. I know that, from talking to him. And he definitely, I wouldn't know who he would, be getting orders from, but there was some weird stuff going on back, especially stuff I read on John Quinn Newshawk. Remember that a long time ago? He did some explorations at Camp Hero. It was on the, if you read some of the early internet stuff, basically is where you'd find it. It's still out there. But he actually found, he went to the building where we found all those papers that we talked about on the Dark Files for the massive amounts of food, and that we took out of there. And he was saying somebody was going in his building, taking his stuff. And it was this guy called Uncle Charlie, but then they called him up and he was this other guy, and he owned a restaurant, Tom Costello, and then he called him up, but it was the first guy. And there was this big runaround, and they kept saying, we'll send you to our higher ups. And they named some other higher ups at the time before Tom Dess. But it was a very interesting story, and it kind of corroborated the papers I found, because I also found a few other blogs since the Dark Files. And I found people that found the checks that I threw in the air to get away from security. We tried to make a distraction by throwing them up because we thought they were chasing us because we took them. And long story short, we got away, we threw the things, but people went and found the checks in the grass right there and wrote about them in their blog, exactly where we threw them. And other people have found them as well. So I've been trying to keep a long list of people who've verified those checks from Boeing for 0 cents, and food bills billed to Montauk Air Force Station in 1987. Yeah, for like multiple tens of thousands of dollars a month.
And so, yeah, so in other words, the mystery about these checks is that we don't know why this money was being spent, or for what reason, being that at that time the base was defunct.
Yeah, it was closed for a good 5 years or more at that point. And the weird thing about that is it could be just somebody doing, maybe they were running like a shell company out of an old base, somehow getting away with it. But it seems like they were buying food for something, I know there were some drills in the time that the base was closed too. They did do some official drills. And I wanted another, just on a side topic, kind of related, but the R&R that they wrote about in the books, that soldiers would be taken to the base in the 70s for R&R, rest and relaxation, and the radar would be turning in and they'd just be having fun, playing sports. I don't know. The guy that I told you about earlier that worked at the Nike base, he actually went to Camp Hero, actually the Montauk Air Force Station at the time, for rest and relaxation in the 70s. He went there twice. I said to him, was the radar turning when you were there? He was like, yeah, it was running. It was turning all day. It didn't stop turning. And I said, do you remember anything else? He said, no, we just had like picnics and, hung out. And I thought, wow, so here's verification that what they wrote about in the book actually was done to people in the military. Not that they were broadcasting certain frequencies on them to test, which I wouldn't put it past, why not catalog a few things? But the point is they did do the R&R there. So I guess somehow Preston had known about that.
And that makes you wonder, how did
for the
Preston
book.
know these things? How did he, he was a very intelligent guy, but sitting with him, and that's what's so
He was,
important about
he
an
was.
interview is you can learn a lot about a person through an interview. So sitting with Preston Nichols, many times I did, going up to his home, sitting with him, looking eye to eye, and then kind of testing how he felt about things. The one thing that always made me consider that there's some truth to what he was saying is that it was such a bizarre story. If he was just making up this adventure story, then they would have just stuck with that. Then why bring up a facet of children being raped and murdered? And that completely tarnishes the idea of this adventure story. And so when I confronted Preston with that, his reaction was, I wouldn't say volatile, but he was uncomfortable for sure. And again, I've seen him off camera and talked about these things as well. So it's like they talked about these things for years and people denied even their possibility. But then we learn about things like Holmesburg Prison, and even though this isn't children, but the Tuskegee medical experiments and so-called radiation experiments, MK Ultra. How could you not believe that this is a possibility? And why wouldn't Montauk be a place for that? How do you, okay, so at some point do you feel, and you might be a main component in this, that number one, it will be proven that there was an underground base that was lied about its existence. And then two, that there were experiments conducted here. And I do want to get into some evidence that you do have of certain rooms and structures. But what is your perspective on all of that over the years and where it's going, if that makes sense?
Over the years, I think that this place has transformed substantially from, where it was still active, but the people on the top side were not knowing what was going on below. And then if there was a big accident in the 80s, which I believe there probably was, because the place looked like it shut down in a hurry. And a lot of people have noticed that. And, there was a period there where it was just left. And that's where I start thinking sometimes that maybe Preston said that he lived there in the first book. And I wondered if they didn't set up shop in some kind of way in there after, maybe to even come up with maybe they were doing things themselves. I never knew like what to make of Preston because as far as what he actually did there, because he's changed his mind and he's told us that he's been reprogrammed, so he doesn't even really know.
Right. And so speaking to the gentleman, James Bruce, that I spoke to a lot, both in Montauk and in the Dark Files, and I've talked to since, he speaking to what you just said about them setting up shop in there and doing things after, James says that's exactly what happened.
That gives me the chills because when I was a kid, it was the last day of kindergarten. My mom said, I tried to ask her recently when exactly it was, but I was drawing on the corner and she was watching from like our driveway, probably like 500 feet away. And my grandmother was coming around the other corner with her Siberian Husky. And I'm sitting there drawing with chalk on the white line where you're supposed to stop. And here comes this van with the door open. And the guy rolled by and they were going to, like, the guy was standing there with his arms out like he was going to grab me. And I just thought they were going to run me over when I was a kid. I saw the van coming and I thought they were going to hit me. But when they passed me, I saw this van and this guy standing there. So they got the plate and it was registered to like a brown car, not a van. And we all heard stories back then about the white vans that would take kids. But the thing that creeps me out the most that I was getting to that connects to what James Bruce said is, I swear the guy, when I saw Al Bielek, he looked exactly like the guy I saw in the van that day. So I know I'm not saying that he's gone, he can't defend himself, and I would never accuse somebody. It just he looks similar to that. So I always had a weird thing to.
Yeah, a lot of people speculate that the white van stories were Preston Nichols picking people up and
Wow. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. No, I've heard that before.
So they freaked out because my mother started waving her hands and yelling, and my grandmother did too, and she let the Siberian Husky off the leash. And I called it. She was like, "Call lady," the dog's name. And I called her, and she came running. And the dog's scary looking. It looked like a wolf, big, huge dog, like a barrel. And they took off, and that's why they got the plate somehow when they came back around. But who knows? I mean, that's pretty. I never heard that before. What you just told me. So
Okay. So do you think the key to unlocking the mystery of Montauk is staying rigidly to the history? Because part of me feels that way. Or do you think people should be open to some of the more outrageous ideas?
I think both, all, like I'll take all the information and mix it together, because the weirdest thing is sometimes in the military history, it's in the gaps of service, or like the times that it was under caretaker status, or some of the way things were, positioned, built, whatever it may be. You find these things in the military history that kind of prove, like in a circumstantial kind of case, that some of the more outlandish, conspiracy kind of thoughts are actually kind of proven by what's in the actual history on record. It's just, like you said, it has to be put into the timeline. And that's why I was dropping every piece of information into the chronological timeline and overlaying it with the story that's, as we know it, of the Montauk Project. And some of the things line up very well. And that makes you think there's something to this. It's a good way to look at it, like two different waveforms, and you're blending them together. You might see those same gaps line up,
Right. I'm very open to a lot of this because, especially in the last few years, we're living in the weirdest times than anyone could have ever imagined, and even world leaders behaving so strangely. I mean, that's just to put it lightly. So it makes you think, and it keeps you open to some of these conspiracies. But at the same time, I think a shortcut, and I've always felt this, a shortcut to proving that the Montauk Project happened is what you're doing, large in part, is finding a lot of evidence and connecting the dots. One of the things that you had for the Dark Files project, and have had for a while, is evidence that there were these testing rooms. Can you describe what they are and where you found all that stuff, or were you actually there before they knocked them down?
Yes. So these rooms, we read about first that there were these LSD rooms with all these colorful patterns and different kinds of wallpaper, psychedelic wallpaper. So we looked in every house. We went in every barracks. They were disguised as, so on the base, the houses weren't in a line like a normal military base, as you know. They were like Cape Cod fishing village. It was supposed to look like. So the houses were all different colors, and they're all, a strewn different setup in different directions. But there was 13 houses, and we went in every one, single top to bottom. We thought we did. And we thought we checked all the houses, and it was, maybe it got taken down or something. But then one day we went into this yellow house, and there it was. We said, we must have missed this like every other time we came here. So we have to come back with a camera immediately. So we went back like the next day or two and took pictures of, there was 2 rooms that were painted, and one was like confetti or like tie-dye. And the other room was perfectly measured, really thick black and white stripes, kind of like the shirts Tim Leary used to wear. And I did look into the whole Tim Leary thing too, which I'll get to. But the other 2 rooms were wallpapered, and there was trim halfway through. So this was all professional. Somebody stapled perfect wood trim, and there was a wallpaper above it and a solid color below. One was leopard print, and the other one was paisley. And it's weird because they said, this is graffiti, but graffiti vandals, graffiti writers, or whoever it may be, they don't put up wallpaper ever. They don't put down. The electric sockets were taped off, and there was no drips on the floor or ceiling. So they paid for this to be done, or somebody did a really good job, professionally did it. They even put the light covers back on after. And long story short, these were supposedly rooms that people were experimented on with psychedelics. Obviously, the patterns would say so, unless it was just some strange party house. So I had to look into all these angles. But what I did find was actually amazing, that in the year 1961, the base was the Army side of the base, because the Army was there in till 59, but they came back to start looking into the Nike base at 216. But in that year, 1961, they turned the radar off for the entire year, because they put it into service in 1960. It was causing interference on all the TVs and radios, like we've heard, every 12 seconds. But they pulled it offline, and they were doing maintenance on it for an entire year. And then turned it back on again in the end of 1961. And then they brought civilians onto the base for 3 years. And then they made them leave after 3 years because they might have had a Nike base being built. But rewind to 1961. In that very year in Harvard, they did the Harvard psilocybin experiment, the Marsh Chapel experiment, the Concord prison experiment. And all three of those, they were given psilocybin mushrooms. And in Montauk in that year, they would have had that kind of, I had to look up if the wallpaper was their psychedelic art in 1961, and it was, and there was. And as you know, the Ken Kesey, that was shortly after they got fired from that Harvard because they got caught giving them to students psilocybin mushrooms. And long story short, I found an old newsletter also to go along with this. I found an old newsletter from the Camp Hero base, and they had some cartoons in there, like a target painted on the radar. And one of the cartoons was tell the boys in ops to feed them more manure, and they had a picture of all these mushrooms growing, psychedelic mushrooms. It was like a cartoon. I thought that's rather odd, But there's this guy named Michael Hollingshead, and he actually was CIA and MI6, and he came from the UK with a whole bunch of LSD from Sandoz, which was the company that made it back then. And he distributed to all of the figures in our culture at the time. The Beatles, two of the Beatles, John Lennon, George Harrison, I thought he said. I have to relook. But he gave it to several musicians, several artists, the heads of military, the heads of universities. He's passed this stuff out everywhere, including Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert at Harvard. Now, if Montauk is just down the coast here, I couldn't see that why they didn't get some to mess with too, because the guys at Harvard, there was a paper that came out that year called The Frey Effect. And that's basically this guy with the last name Frey he discovered that you could hear a microwave when it's pointed at your head. It would be either a click, a chirp, a knock, or, there's 4 sounds that they describe. And so the guys at Harvard, when they were doing these LSD psilocybin experiments, they thought it would be great. One of them actually said it would be great to blend that with the psychedelics, like aim the microwave at the people as they're on psychedelics. And in that very year, Montauk was the perfect place to make that happen for a very short, like they come in, build the room, do their trials for like a few months, and then get out. They should have painted over the walls, but so that's what was left behind. And when I looked up what that building was, at one point, that was the commander's house.
And so do you think at some point it's going to be proven that there was not only a huge covert operation underground in a base, but also that these atrocities actually happened there as well?
That's I think one leads to the other. So if they lied about one, like there being a giant underground, in the same token as lying about, experiments being done. Therefore, if you prove there's a giant underground, then you would guess that there's also experiments that were done. And I think LiDAR will be the time when we could all finally use LiDAR. If we can scan, I don't know how deep it goes, but, they could penetrate like a lot of the sand in the desert. And Google is doing LiDAR for the world, but they just started in a small part of the UK. So eventually when we're able to use LiDAR on Montauk, we're going to see right through the ground. It's over at that point. They can't hide it anymore. That and Batteries 216 is getting awfully close to the bluff. It's eroding so bad, it's going to tumble into the sea at some point. So wow. One way or another, these things will come out. I just hope we could find out a little sooner than waiting for nature to take its course.
Well, I think it's important. These discussions are important. Your expeditions over there, your explorations, getting more people to go. Do you think that, since Stranger Things became a phenomena, like it's just all over the world, and so many people are going to the Montauk base because of that, and this growing mystery, is it making anyone over there nervous? I mean, does Tom Dess constantly chase people out of the base?
No,
these
now
days?
It seems to be so lax that I see families walking on Radar Hill now, like kids. And I was really shocked at that. I've heard when Joe was just retiring last year, he told me that they don't care anymore. People are hanging off the radar doing parkour, and they're just like, one day somebody's going to fall. I actually talked to a guy and he sent me a video of him climbing up that pole on top of the antenna, the omnidirectional antenna, and he climbed to the top of that thing. I was like, my stomach dropped out watching that. But yeah, people are up there and they're all over. You can't really get to the top anymore. The stairs are totally collapsed in the radar. It's kind of sad, but you could go up there. You'd have to climb on the sides of the stairs with the metal. It's really dangerous.
Well, that's all these people are coming out because they're coming to see Hawkins' lab. That's what they want to see.
Yes. I think it's great, in that sense. And I think Tom Dess isn't chasing people because this is the perfect cover. Now it's like this, come and check out the park. It's bringing more visitors. There's a wedding. People get married there all the time. They have this wedding spot in, kind of east of Battery 216, closer to the lighthouse.
Such a weird place to have a wedding unless you're just like major Stranger Things fans.
They have a wedding trail. And they made all these trails in the woods, so now I can go exploring the whole woods that we never got to really walk through. And some of it's just really nice to walk. And I keep. Also, another thing is, I know you had one experience there in the skies, and I've been catching so many things. When I go to zoom in on a plane to like test my camera, something flies by so fast. I slow it down and zoom in. It looks like a typical UFO. I got a couple of these now, like photobombing me almost. And I got to show them to you. I'll string them together at least so you can see how many there are.
Yeah, I talked to a gentleman way back. I have it as like one of my very early extras. It's also on my YouTube channel where he was shark fishing. And, he confided in me a story. He wanted his identity concealed because he just didn't want anyone to know he was connected with any conspiratorial type ideas or whatever, because people think you're crazy. Or at least back then they really did think you were crazy. But he told a story of on the way back from the shark fishing trip, and it was at night, something came out of the water just near Montauk Point and hovered over his boat and then flew away. And I believe the guy because, again, he wasn't trying to profit off of anything. He met me covertly, insisted that he was completely covered up. He just wanted to tell me this story, and we were talking for months, and this was going back to 06 or 07. I think I interviewed him.
That's like a USO kind of underwater submerged object, and it's a lot of fishermen see them. It's very, and I believe it at Montauk. It's a very strange place. There's always something you might see there. It's I actually saw something run across the road when we first went back there recently with my cousin and Danielle, and they didn't see it. I said, speed up, because I thought, this looked like a really tall, dark shadow kind of. And I told them, you got to go. And I went to look at the bushes where it just ran to see if they were moving, like if a creature hit it. And I forgot about it. I thought that was really weird. I drew it when I got home because it was like really skinny, like a shadow. And then Joe Lafrino tells me later that he saw something identical, he told me. And I said, that's crazy. I saw that too.
At the end of the day, your collective research and people like Paul Fagan, and I'm not exactly sure if he really felt there were mind control projects going on over there, but I think you believe that. And at the end of the day, really, you'd be doing such an incredible service to the memory, if this is true, and I believe it is, to some extent. It must have been, right? So if this is true, ultimately, your efforts looking into this over the years, all of that compiled, yes, it appeases a certain interest in urban exploration, in mysteries and conspiracies, in people who love Stranger Things and the fact that it's based on some real stuff, people who have been interested in the Montauk Project for years. But ultimately, I think that your research could lead to the revelation that there was a horrible covert mind control experiment there, and that there were children murdered there, because up until the point that someone does discover it and someone does prove it, those kids are unknown. In other words, they're runaways or people who disappeared and were never heard from again. How do you feel about that? And do you think about that when you're trying to solve this puzzle?
Yeah, I know that it's always something that is on your mind there, and the amount of death and loss there. It's part of the feeling that people get when they walk on the surface. They feel that kind of haunted. it's kind of fading away on the surface, I feel, as it's a park. There's more jovial things happening around it, but it's still there. And that's always something that's on the mind. I mean, I know people were said to be lost in time, and other people were said to be buried on the property. And that's another reason for looking for these structures underground. I mean, at some point, hopefully, we'll find something. The place there is pulled in so many people and never let them out. I mean, physically and mentally, it's got people into the. I mean, I'm sure that they had people. If you're doing a project, like if you have some kind of technology, let's say you did open a Stargate, you're going to start sending people through it. I mean, think of any government agency that wouldn't start putting people, once you make a portal or a Stargate, theoretically, if you did, you're going to start putting people through it at some point. You might start with animals or objects, but eventually you're going to start sending human subjects. It's the same thing with anything, any kind of trials. They always move to the human trials at some point in any science. So if whatever science was created, they did use it on humans. So that's something you could safely assume. And then knowing that they were younger, because there's a part of this that has to do with psychic abilities, and a lot of people have heightened some better psychic abilities when they're young, maybe before their pineal calcifies or whatever reason that you want, as we start to build up filters to protect us from the world. But when you're young, you have all these abilities, so this would be their target, the people that they're trying to, at least maybe they were using them to try to do some other things too, because remote viewing was studied in the 70s heavily by the government. So I always wondered if they didn't do remote viewing tests there in the time. I think they went with the times, and they were ahead of the times. So whatever we were learning about later, they probably tried a little bit of it at Montauk. I've heard people say that they did particle beam weapons there and remote viewing in the 70s. But see, there were probably other children that were used, but they were already, they weren't brought in off the streets. Some of them were plucked out of schools and stuff, people that scored on an IQ test or something. And then they kind of put them in a different kind of program in Montauk as well. They go in, they do remote viewing, and then they get to go home. A lot of the times they're a military child whose own parents put them into these programs, from what I've read. So there's the people who were pulled off the streets unwillingly, and sadly, those would be the more, not to say that they were any less psychic, because that would be something they'd have to determine unless they were watching them ahead of time, which you said they were looking for targets. So what information were they using to select targets? Opportunity of something that's convenient, or did they have some kind of knowledge that this person is a gifted person? And if they're a gifted person, are you going to throw them through the portal, or are you going to try to set them up with something more like the Montauk chair, put them in there, or have them do remote viewing, whatever it might be? I think they tried to use people to the best of what they thought would help their experiments. And I'm sure there are bodies somewhere. But I don't know if we can't ever get into these undergrounds and they collapse, if they're not using them. Maybe they finally abandoned it. Maybe they are still down there somewhere. I've always looked into the geology to see if it was possible. And it turns out there is volcanoes under Long Island. And so you hear these things, you don't think that they're possible, but then you start seeing things in real facts that brings you back to them. You're constantly revisiting these topics.
And if you were to just kind of define Paul Fagan in a way, how did you see him as because he was really taken by Camp Hero as much as you were. Can you just tell me a little bit about Paul and your perspective on him?
Sure.
And then I'll start getting into the last piece.
Yeah, I would love to. It would be in my honor. I thought he was the only other person out there who was doing something similar with the history, because I had just started getting into the history and learning what all the World War II stuff was when he had already been doing that as well. And after talking to him, I went more down the historical road, because I saw that he was looking at it from a more less of a paranormal, or basically in a more straightforward way, which I thought, that's a good point. So let's we share information on all of the historical stuff we could find and try to plot out the structures. And I thought that was a great straightforward way to try to map the base. And he was really good at mapping the base and knowing when it comes down to it, I would say just knowing where all the buildings were he was probably the only other person I could talk to that like wanted to geek out on the names of the buildings and what they were for and what year they were built and all that stuff, which maybe sometimes I tell certain people who only want the more fantastic stuff about the story. Like at a talk once, they just wanted all Stranger Things, and I was talking history, and they were almost, bored. I thought I was boring them at that point. So he was somebody that we could talk about that kind of more. I guess it would be like military history, but it really is a major piece of it's the information that we're looking for that's missing some of the times. And I have to thank him for that, if I could. And this is my way of doing it. And of course, I will definitely always give him the credit due when the things that he put me onto and helped me, focus on at the time. Because now that's a major part of what I have is this giant full military history of Montauk. And I refer to it all the time for time frame. It's the chronological stories that are on record. So it's helped me tremendously to figure out other things. So when you look at one thing somebody did and it grows into so many things in your life, that's kind of like what happened. This one angle that we started on, looking into certain things, talking about them. We were supposed to meet up and I was going to share all my papers with him. And he had the back surgery at the time. But I think he would have loved to see the final product. I told him I'm just so unorganized, but when I get this stuff all together, it'll be a lot easier to give to you. Because before it was like 12 suitcases of papers. Now I have some kind of, working timeline. He would have loved to see where it went from when we last talked. But he's just a great guy, and he really knew a lot about the base. He was one of the people that knew so much about it.
And where do you think his ultimate goal? Because I know he expressed certain ideas and things he wanted to do. What was it completely that Paul was trying to accomplish in all this time, and all of those years looking around and searching and researching? What was Paul's goal in all of it?
That's one thing he kept cards close to the vest, but he did share a few things, and it did have to do with the generators. A certain model that was like what he described as sounded like a nuclear powered generator of some sort, or some kind of small particle accelerator. And it was a model that they were using to make underground much more easier to work in, to have power without running the usual utility and infrastructure. It was something along the lines of a great new technology. And you know what it was? It was very similar to the way that they had rolled out all of the top secret stuff at Montauk, which today is just boring. But when they first, they did the first radio transmission from Montauk to New Hampshire, and then from Montauk to Georgia, before the famous first radio transmission from Georgia to the Eiffel Tower. The two at Montauk, they were the first ones. And so that was top secret. So something what Paul found, it may not be fully, about time travel or anything, but what it was that he shared with me. Now, he may know more. He didn't always tell me, he gave me hints. But what he had found is some kind of amazing power source for deep underground locations.
And what, conspiratorial obsessed think, and then they'll learn about Paul and suggest, well, he knew too much.
Yeah.
What would you say?
I'm not sure what happened, but I don't think that we would all be in danger. Also, if we were talking that happened, we would know too. I mean, we've been out there saying things, looking into things, so we probably would have experienced some kind of intimidation, and that makes you wonder why. Maybe it's just fun because there's so many people out there looking into these kind of things that we're just kind of in the sea of people. Maybe I'm not sure, but yeah, that's probably what people would say. I'm sure you're right about that. At some point.
That's how those legends began, or those ideas or conspiracies. But what would you say to all the new people now exploring this history and the base itself? And obviously a good majority of them only want to hear about aliens and monsters and dimensional rifts and things like that. But what would you suggest to them?
I would suggest to keep, looking into it and try to look for some of the older sources, read all the stories, and so you could see personal experiences are the best thing when you read other people's personal experiences about the base. So go back in time and look at some of them, and you'll be amazed. There's more than just the book and what Stranger Things, did nowadays with the story. I would also say to look into some of the real history and mix it with some of the crazy things you've heard, like kind of like what I was saying that I was doing, just because it gives you a little bit of both sides. And go there and explore, and feel the place out yourself, and don't just, try to climb to the top of the radar, but take a good look around and think about the what if this is possible, if you think it's possible, and just check it out and read up. I would just say to keep looking into it because it's such a deep well of amazing story, amazing reports. There's so many things that are fascinating about the topic, but you have to read more away from the surface of the story. That would be my message, to dig deeper, and you'll find the good stuff. The surface story is good, but when you don't, when you keep getting it over and over, different versions of it, like the synopsis videos on YouTube, that's about all you're going to get out of it. And you're just going to think it's a crazy tale. But once you start looking into the finer details, that's where you find the really good stuff. That would be my message.
Sure. That's a great message.
Thanks.
And what I usually do with every guest on this show is that, and again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's whatever comes to mind when I ask. But if you were conscious on your way out of this world, what would you take with you if you could? And that could be anything, including memories. What would you take with you when it's time to leave this world?
That's really good. Probably I would just say all the things you probably did for other people that helped them, things of love, of a positive nature. I probably would leave everything else behind and just think of those, what did you do with your life when you were here? Did you help people or did you hurt them? And if you hurt them, did you make it up to them? Or just try to focus on the things, the people you love and the things that you did and just be happy with what you did do on this planet. I don't think I would be happy if I just worked my whole entire life away and never did anything fun. That's just not me. So I think, was I true to myself? And if I was, then I'd have a big smile on my face.
Welcome back to Off to the Witch. I'm your host, Christopher Garatano, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight and learning about Paul Fagan, as well as Brian Minnick's story. I hope for you explorers out there that you all think of Paul when you dive into your own adventures. I know I won't forget him, as he generously contributed to my own projects Montauk Chronicles and The Dark Files. My condolences to his family and friends. I know Paul will be missed, but certainly not forgotten. Next week, we dive into the world of the tarot and all of the secrets they have to reveal. Until then, try to enjoy the daylight.